Very much for joining us in this rather lovely and intimate and very supportive environment of a small circle of people who are interested and have a stake and have a claim in Theaster Gates' practice. We had a couple of absolutely fantastic events already leading up to this conversation today. You may have attended the opening of his exhibition, Theaster Gates, A Way of Working, which is up through October 5th at Parsons New School for Design. We had a wonderful conversation that went on for several hours yesterday morning through the afternoon under the same title, and examined certain ideas emanating and being core features of his work, among them migration, belief, organizing, and then we looked at vocabularies of criticality in the work and in the reception of his work. We enjoyed, or some of us enjoyed, his outstanding lecture and performance last night, where he inhabited various roles. All of this will be documented online on the Verlis Center's website in a couple of days. The conversation today will also be videotaped, at this point simply for archival purposes. So I just want you to be aware that by joining us in this circle, you agree to be videotaped. Some of the core ideas that were clear yesterday concerned systems and to what extent one is part of a system, able to manipulate the system, move across various systems, so interstitial spaces. The moment where one practice or one activity becomes something else was very much part of the conversation. And Theaster mentioned it quite explicitly in his lecture last night when he began by saying, how do I divide my time, or rather, how do I disperse my various activities? Where do I find the right vessel and the right platform for a certain activity at a certain moment? He also called on us and asked us to be specific to the moment and to the time we're in, and said, this is the world, this is where our world, this is where we're at, this is what we have to work with and what we're called on to work with. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Lydia Matthews, who will be moderating or facilitating our conversation today. Yesterday was Shannon Jackson, here on my right, who was the facilitator for the perhaps more public or more formal presentations. And again, I'm very glad you're joining us, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you again for putting together such an extraordinarily inspiring series of events. These things are a long time coming, as you well know, and it's to no small. I mean, you had a huge part in really being the beacon through this whole thing, so thank you for all of your efforts. As Karen said, this really, I've imagined to be a space where we can really process many of the ideas that a number of us heard yesterday in the forums, perhaps witnessed in the exhibition, and certainly if you were able to go to the talk, also got a different kind of angle on last night when Theaster really spoke on a very personal level about what sustains his practice, how he himself navigated his own kind of educational trajectory and his that kind of life-work balance, which is so key to being able to sort of forge a place in an otherwise, difficult art world to enter, frankly. And so what I would like to do is to suggest that what we have available to us in the next 2 hours is a space where hopefully we can get to know each other a little bit. And for that reason, I was really hoping that we could have just one row of a circle, if those of you who are perhaps needing to leave a little early or something, maybe just get a spot where you can, I think anywhere you could exit from this circle. But it would be nice for a change to see each other's faces, I think, and also to have an opportunity to find out who feels a kind of stake in this practice and is dedicated enough to not only perhaps going to a marathon event as yesterday was, but also, really willing to come and open it up even further and unpeel the layers more. So just to give you an overview of what I hope we can accomplish today, I sort of saw it breaking down into 3 territories, if you will. One was to say I'm sure were, and we began to see in the cracks yesterday, particular issues bubbling up that were more controversial, more difficult territories, perhaps because of how we're used to, assumptions that we bring to the table about what it means to be an artist or what it means to do urban planning, or, that there are perhaps aspects of the Dorchester House project or aspects of the way that Theaster is working that we would like to critique more fully. So that's one opportunity to say, what is it that is troubling, perhaps, and also what can we learn from that breaking open of that, so that we can see what parts of it are just disrupting something that we're taught to believe, and that perhaps are being challenged to rethink, or things that really do present a problem that is worth stating and kind of opening up and looking at with a sharper focus. That said, inevitably, I think we're here to take note of the insights that we've gleaned from his practice. And sometimes we can do that through a critical lens, but also through the lens of saying, what is it that we see him doing that is really worthy of considering how to operate on in a wider array of arenas, and particularly in a school like the New School. So what are the lessons learned from his practice that we saw either in the show, in the conversations yesterday, and or in his talk last night? So, and then thirdly, that really leads us into what do we want to take away from this institutionally? What is it that students need to be learning in order to be making change in the world the way that Theaster does? Either as an artist, as a writer, there are many practices I know from the students who were here yesterday. So a lot of the day I'm also hoping that we can come away with a series of bullet points asking the question of how and what do students need to learn, and what are the best ways to teach that? And also, what kinds of tools do we need to give students? I mean, we bring our own experiences of having had these conversations and having thought deeply about it, and obviously, it can be students. It might also be other community members. I'm talking students in the sense that I'm always a perpetual student, and I think people who are curious about the world are. So they might be in an institution, or they might be in a job, or they might be practicing independently. But that sense of what do we need to learn? What are the best ways to teach? And then what are the tools that will really enable us to get people thinking about the implications of Dorchester House project and Theaster's way of working. So, that's one thing that we want to talk about, and that can also include potentially the publication that will ultimately evolve out of this work. And then also, I think it's important to think a little bit about how do we forge better alignments, either within our own university that enables this to go on. I mean, this was kind of exceptional, frankly. And that's why we're also thankful to Karen for doing it, giving faculty members from multiple disciplines a chance to look together at an object, at a practice, at a place. Having, as you heard, for those of you who were here yesterday, many of us had the opportunity to go and experience firsthand in Chicago and get to know one another. And so it's also a kind of very rare moment of community building and serious conversations about what are what did we each bring to the table, and what are the assumptions that this kind of a work challenges? So there are also alignments with, at the New School at least, with the social justice initiative, and how do we institutionally really think about putting these parts together so that they function in a more fruitful way? Welcome, everybody. Please try and take a chair in the front circles, if possible, so we fill those out first. Just some logistical things. Wow, there's a big group coming in. That's great. What I'd like to begin by doing is to suggest to you, because we are videotaping for the archive, we need to have the sound of our conversation going into a mic, basically, in order to capture it clearly. So we've got a few mics around the room, and as the conversation evolves, I'm hoping that those of you who have a mic nearest, we can just pass it to one another and keep it moving as quickly as possible. But I also very much want to start the day by saying, again, this is about thinking about our own kinds of community intersections. And the only way to do that is to find out who's in this room and where you're coming from. So what would be nice to hear is if we could just go around very briefly, introduce ourselves, say if we're in a particular division, if we're a teacher, a staff member, if we work for a different organization, if we're an independent artist operating in New York City or elsewhere, if you could just kind of identify who you are, what your practice is, I think that we can begin to personalize this a little bit more, which is such an important part of a conversation like this. So again, my name is Lydia Matthews. I teach at Parsons in the School of Art, Media, and Technology, and had the pleasure and privilege of pleasure and privilege of working with the Vera List Center for a number of years, and also being involved in the jurying process for the first Vera List Prize winner. So it was also very interesting for me to have witnessed those conversations and to think a little bit more about what, why Theaster emerged at that moment. So let's go around and say who we are and what we do. And just to, again, my affiliation is with the school, but as far as a practice goes, I'm a curator who works a lot with socially engaged practices in the public realm, and also a critical writer.
Hi, I'm Noreen Letty. I'm an artist. I do a lot of socially engaged art projects, and I teach at Parsons in art, media, and technology. Also, I'm in fine arts and also in the first year program.
I'm Kevin McQueen. I teach community development finance at the Milano School.
Richard Harper. I work in the jazz program.
Radhika Subramaniam. I teach at Parsons in the School of Art and Design, History and Theory, also a curator here.
My name is Veena, and I am a student at Parsons first year.
Do you want to go first? Oh. My name is Annalisa Jensen, and I'm an independent artist working here in New York. And I have 3 big projects. The one that I am thinking about mostly in terms of this whole event and the work of Theaster Gates is a project that I did going back to my own roots, which is in a depopulated town on the coast of Denmark, where I was able to get funding to provide for 5 artists coming from here, working there, and now I'm figuring out how to hook that up institutionally. And what you were asking about, I think, what about off-site, off-university site places where you can work with particular projects and with your art. And I think that would be one way of working with both students, institutions, and also local population.
My name is Jeremy. I'm also a student at Parsons in my first year.
My name is Peter, and I'm a student at Parsons first year.
I'm Susan Morris, and I am not affiliated with the school. I'm a producer of media in the arts, and I'm currently doing a lot of journalism for architects, but about the arts and media.
Good morning. I'm Erin Schmidt, and I'm a student at Parsons in the fashion design program. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Caesar. I'm a student, first year, a fashion designer.
My name's Lila, and I'm also a first year Parsons fashion design student.
Hi, my name's Catherine Simon, and I'm a professor in the AAS fashion program.
Hi, my name is Lillian, and I'm a fashion student at Parsons, first year too.
Hi, I'm Ina Archer. I'm first year faculty at Parsons, and I'm a filmmaker and visual artist.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm a student at Parsons in the fashion degree program as well.
Hi, I'm Kate Hadley Williams. I work for Theaster Gates Studio and for his nonprofit Rebuild Foundation.
Hi, I'm Katie Holton. I'm an artist based in New York. I've worked on different public art projects and was lucky enough to hear Theaster speak last night, which was quite something. And so I'm very interested in those dilemmas that he spoke about, where we're kind of split between life, work, and interested in the whole conversation.
I'm Suzanne Opton, independent artist and photographer working in public art, and I teach at International Center of Photography.
Hi, I'm Nicole Miller. I'm a fiction writer and teach creative writing and literature at a school called the New York Center for Art and Media Studies, which is an interdisciplinary one-semester undergraduate residency program of Bethel University, which recently decided to close the program for financial reasons. And so I'm interested in thinking about new models of teaching and learning outside of an institutional platform. So that's why I'm here.
My name is Kathleen McQueen. I write on the arts. I have an online column called Shifting Connections.
Hi, I'm Sandra Payne. I'm an artist. I live in New York. And I'm particularly interested in Theaster because he's also has a project in my hometown, St. Louis, Missouri.
Hi, I'm Naomi Miller. I work for the Verlis Center, and I'm also an artist.
Hello, I'm Third Fernandez, a fashion design student at Parsons.
Hi, I'm Mitch Ackensweiler, first year fashion design student at Parsons.
Sheldon Silberstein. I've done some sculpture.
I'm Prudence Whittlesey. I'm a painter in New York.
My name is Rumpel Sestasio. I'm a sophomore in the AAS program of fashion marketing at Parsons.
I'm Kirsten. I'm a BFA student in integrated design, and I'm a sophomore this year.
I'm Jane Bennett, and I teach political theory in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and I like the Verlis Center.
I'm Shannon Jackson, and I am a professor in performance studies and in rhetoric at UC Berkeley, where I also direct the Arts Research Center there. I write about socially engaged art, fairly recently a book called Social Works, and I was lucky to be asked to be a nominator for this award, and nominated Theaster.
I'm Karen Coney, and am grateful to all of you, Shannon and Lydia in particular, and everyone else. I am really challenged by the question of how we can relate to a practice or a project that we consider extremely successful, but that is not part of our community. That's what I hope to learn today or understand better.
My name's Deborah Fisher. I'm the executive director of A Blade of Grass. We're a new funding nonprofit that's solely dedicated to nurturing socially engaged art.
How about if we pass, let's get the mic back on around to the other side of the room, so we've got one handy nearby everybody. So welcome again, everybody. It's great that people from so many different places and practices are here today to think about this work. For my benefit, and perhaps just to help contextualize a little bit more, how many of you were not able to make it either to the talk or the exhibition or the conference yesterday? How many of you are sort of entering this at the first time? I'm kind of guessing some of the, okay, so quite a few. Okay, so the thing then that I think is maybe worth saying, for, as Karen said, yesterday we had a number of faculty members, largely from the new school, who had gone to Chicago together to see Theaster's work and to meet him and to meet Kate, who was fantastic and helped us really understand what was going on there. One of the things in that trip that was quite important was that I think it was Theaster's idea, or maybe Karen, it was both of yours, or came out of a conversation with the three of you, that Theaster thought it was important for us not only to see Dorchester House, but also to understand Dorchester House in relationship to some of the practices in Chicago and the communities in Chicago who had inspired him. So we went to Experimental Station, which is Dan Peterman's project, and we also went to Hull House, which is a museum that really kind of looks back on a leader in labor history, so those two things very much framed how we were then looking at the Dorchester House. I say that because one of the things we tried to do in the conversations yesterday was to suggest that it's really important to understand the various contexts that a work like this has relevance in relationship to. So yesterday's presentations not only explored themes like migration and ecologies of organizing and mobilizing and aspects of spirituality and belief, and I'm trying to remember the name of the last. The vocabularies, yes, thinking about how this impacts the way we try to write about and speak about work that actually is at the intersection of so many different kinds of ways of making and so many different kinds of publics and practices. So I think it's critical that we understand the lens through which we're looking at the work and be very mindful of how our practices and our assumptions are shaping our vision of that thing. That's one of the things that came out yesterday. I think one thing that also is important to realize that came up in a number of conversations is the fact that we have to also try to put the Dorchester House in a context that helps us understand what it's about. So not only through the lenses of different disciplines, but also, as Theaster did when we went to Chicago, in relationship to other people who preceded him. And I was struck last night, to open up with the conversation today, with what happened at the very end of the lecture last night. For those of you who weren't there, Theaster really spoke on a very personal level about, as we've said, this balance of art and life, the way he, sort of understood how, taking what he learned over the years from his family members and from his education, and understanding that learning comes from, not only the institutional, but perhaps from your grandma or your neighbor or other people, and that all of those things are what you take and have inform your practice. But that there was a woman at the end of the conversation who stood up, and her name was Julie Patton. And she said, Theaster, I want to introduce you to your alter ego. And she said, I'm somebody who has basically been doing something very, very similar to what you've done. And I started doing it in, I think, the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. 13. She'd been doing it for 13 years. 13 or 14 years. Yeah, 1973. So, but essentially what she was saying is like, and she talked about giving up on the art world and kind of moving herself away from that around 1981. And I think one thing that's important and that maybe didn't get talked about enough yesterday is that, or that would be helpful for us to think about, is how is it that there are so many people who are trying to do community engaged practices out in the world, in, you know, literally not only in New York City or in Chicago or the US, but all over the world. And there are increasingly in the last, you know, maybe 5 to 10 years, more and more art world attention on to particular practices like this as becoming significant. But that there are a lot of people who are still in the shadows. And there are aspects of these kinds of practices that become more or less desirable depending on the needs of the institutions or the communities that choose whether or not to support them, right? So one thing that in listening to her and thinking about, well, what does it really mean for Theaster to have kind of gained a level of notoriety that, you know, earns him the prize and the exhibitions in the leading art, you know, venues around the world and events, and have other people not get that. I mean, it's a constant kind of question, but it has to. I guess I want to tease it out a little more by saying, you know, what is it that makes his practice in particular so desirable? Right? And also, what are the forces in the world that allow for certain people and certain kinds of practices to rise and others to either be squelched or to remain vital but largely unseen to a larger public. And so I thought it would be worth just sort of looking again very briefly in starting that question, in trying to understand the context that we're living in right now that enables us to be sitting in this room and benefiting from Theaster's work. Again, he was born in 1973, and he spoke a bit about how his own education was in urban planning as well as fine art. And just to give you some details on that, in 1996, he graduated with a BS degree in urban planning and ceramics. Okay, so again, one of the things that he spoke very passionately about in his talk was how do you take the things that really matter most to you and keep them in alignment with each other so that they inform each other and that they sustain you as a practitioner. So even then, he was forming his college education, his undergraduate education, with a dual major, right? So that he could have his hands in the clay, because that's what mattered to him, and also so that he could do the urban planning, which he said came out of witnessing his father's involvement with 9 kids in the family on the west side of Chicago, you know, trying to keep a life as in construction work and in roofing, right? And getting laid off for political reasons in the company, and realizing the struggle of that, and how does one think about building houses and the role of housing and livelihoods and labor. So urban planning was something that he gravitated to, as he described it, because of those very intimate life experiences. In 1998, he got his MA, he went right into graduate school, and he got his MA in both fine arts and religious studies at the University of Cape Town. So there was obviously a need that he felt, he didn't talk about why, but to leave the US and to think about what he could learn from another culture, and particularly one in Africa. And then in 2006, he went back to get another master's degree, this time in MS in urban planning and ceramics and religious studies. Okay, from Iowa State University again, where he had gotten his original BA degree. So there's something very interesting, I think, about that trajectory, and seeing the way in which you might have to forge write your own major kind of approach to create the dialogue between things that institutions, even though for all the rhetoric of transdisciplinarity, create a lot of boundaries that don't allow you to do that very easily, but you have to be very persistent in the vision. So that happened. And then he talked about how he worked as an artist for a long time in the shadows, largely, not really getting any limelight. So because I want to look at the forces a little bit that made him more visible, I think it's interesting that he finished his this degree in 2006, but even as early as 2005, he was starting to have exhibitions, and they were ceramics exhibitions, largely. Right? So they were at the Tokoname Museum of Ceramic History in Japan. He was in a group show. And also at cultural centers, not art museums, but cultural centers in Chicago and Iowa. So, you know, there is that kind of networking, if you will, or a support system of the place that you go to school and the kinds of links you create outside of the university setting that enables you to get a foothold in showing that I think is worth pointing out. And then by 2008, so it was interesting that the early years were really mainly as a ceramic artist or in some African-American artist shows. So there's something about also, for those of you who are unfamiliar with how the art world works, you know, these things have historically been sort of separated zones. And it's only in very recent history where you start to see those convergences happening. But in 2008, he not only then started to have an exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum, so you know, still Midwestern, but in a museum context, but also in that year, because of the interests of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, they decided to do a show that was about the heartland, right? So all of, you know, as I said, the art practices were largely looking increasingly, as in the last few years, at practices that they had been ignoring for a long time, craft practices, etc. So and in particular, the Van Abbe Museum was interested in the heartland, you know, the Midwest of the U.S., which is also largely overlooked. We really are very bi-coastally biased in the art world in the U.S. So it was interesting that a European museum that then began to have a kind of curatorial circuitry that gave him visibility, and it was because the Van Abbe Museum teamed up with the Smart Art Museum at the University of Chicago, where he was working. So there's also a way in which the university link is playing a role too in enabling the art world to find people that they hadn't yet, quote unquote, discovered, right? So I say that because, you know, in his talk, Theaster really kept emphasizing that it was about 4 years ago that this turned around. So I think it's important to say, well, what happened at that 4 year ago mark? And because of these other things that I was just describing, the curator, Francesco Bonami, invited him to participate in the 2010 Whitney Biennial. And Kate, you can help me if I'm getting any of these details wrong. Please do speak up. But in my understanding, because he was a largely, quote unquote, unknown artist in those kind of larger art world circuits, yeah.
I'm pretty sure he was shown in several major art fairs prior to that. Because I remember
Yeah.
seeing him in a solo booth. Kavi
Yeah.
Gupta was representing him in Chicago.
Yeah.
I think prior to 2010.
Yes.
And I specifically remember seeing his work in like Art Basel Miami.
Yeah. Well, so that's where I was just getting to, because that's the point.
But I mean, it wasn't strictly through the museum
Right.
kind of network. He really was getting it.
Right.
His representation with Kavi Gupta was simultaneous to his showing at the Whitney Biennial.
Yeah. So what I understood is Kavi Gupta, he went to Kavi Gupta to say, you know, can you help me out here? Can we talk about how to maneuver through this? It's a new circuit, right? And so Kavi Gupta thought that it would be wise to position him more visibly prior to his arrival in the Whitney Biennial. And so they took his works to NADA Miami, which is an art fair that happens simultaneously with Miami Art Basel. So there are lots of art fairs. And, again, curators talk to each other, collectors are looking for people. And so I think it's important to realize that he brought with him the pieces that were being featured were these large-scale shoeshine thrones that were based on some actual chairs, but he had made them out of clapboard siding from the building that he had restored. And so when they went, these big chairs, these thrones, went to the Miami, or to Miami in the NADA fair, he decided that he would perform them. And so he sat down and actually started shoe shining. And all of a sudden, all those collectors are like, who's this guy over here shining shoes? And they all, of course, and that's a beautiful chair. And so the lines started to happen. Everybody wanted their shoes. And Theaster saw it as an opportunity to have a conversation with these people and sort of say, like, okay, who do you think I am? I'm a shoe shiner, and I'm Theaster, and I'm the artist. And how does this break open everything you understand about labor and art and its intersection? Okay, so I think that personal connection, on the one hand, there are personal connections with art world curators and collectors who have an eye on particular curators and galleries and things like that. But there's also something really important about the way that Theaster saw that opportunity as one that he could, connect on a personal level with people and have it be very real. So that was something that got a lot of buzz, that then when the Whitney Biennial opened, people were like, oh, I've heard about this guy, Theaster Gates. And of course, then after that, there were a number, oh, and by the way, those chairs sold immediately for $12,000. So I say that because it's very important in Theaster's work that you understand that a lot of the revenue flow that supports the rebuilding projects is coming from the art world. There's huge money in the art world. So it is important to understand how the context actually works. And then, of course, later he had a number of exhibitions in craft museums, in art museums, and then ultimately last year at Documenta, which is arguably probably the most visible and largest international exhibition that is always seen as historically significant. So I just say those things because, and I think it's interesting to realize that when we were in Chicago, he also talked about how collectors then started coming and wanting to come to Dorchester, and scholars and others, interested artists, wanted to come and see what he was doing, so that it automatically linked back from the commodity world of the art world to the project that was at the heart of what was driving his practice. And that, like a German collector, for example, came and he said, he told us that the German collector wanted to buy the Black Library. So, you've got to wonder about these things on a deeper level, and to say, okay, well, what is it that produces a desire for a German art collector to want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on Theaster's library that's filled with books about and by African American cultural figures for his own home collection, So what's going on with that, and how do we begin to understand this context of who gets in the limelight and who doesn't, and how that begins to speak to various kinds of cultural desires in this moment right now? And of course, the ability to duplicate the library was possible, because you just need to make an edition of the books. You need to kind of find the books again. And he agreed to do it because, again, it's really about the revenue flow back to the bigger project. So I wanted just to put that out a little bit and to be reminded of Julia Patton's provocation about why was it you and not I? And to say, like, what is it that enables this work to be so timely and so have so much cultural currency right now? So rather than dominate anymore, I just wanted to set the stage, and I want to turn it over to people who might want to speak to that.
Hi. I was at Theaster's talk yesterday, and I was at Chicago, and I had a thought after it, and somebody told me I should bring it up at this forum today. And since I have a class in 9 minutes, I took the opportunity to talk first. And Lydia, you actually laid out the groundwork for what I was asking last night. That Theaster said something about, and it speaks to the lady who, Julie Patton. He said something about having a calling, and I'm glad you're here, Kate. And now, since I'm a performing artist, where there are some of us in the performing arts who are wildly famous and extremely rich, and that speaks to the other thing that you're talking about. To do what Theaster's doing, he said it yesterday, you cannot do it without having a calling. Because Julie Patton had the same calling, but you can't stay there enough years to make it work. As a performing artist, I tell every student that I have, if you're not willing to stay for 5 years, don't bother. It's not going to work. So you need to, so if we are an institution, the things that we have to figure out as an institution is, how do we get reflective learning in our students so that they can begin to identify what their real passion is to do? Because this will not happen without that kind of calling. Why I'm saying I'm glad you're here, Kate, is that I don't want to put you on the spot, but to do what you're doing, you have to have some kind of call. Do you understand what I'm saying? And you might be able to speak to that for the rest of us. So that's a key thing. The second thing that Theaster pointed on, that hit on what you hit on, Lydia, about why at this moment. One of the things that struck us all in Chicago, and it's difficult to tease this out of the thing, Theaster Gates is a man of an extremely great charisma. I don't think you can take it out of the picture. I mean, I was talking yesterday, and I was talking about some music, and Theaster started to sing. I didn't know he was going to sing. So I sang with him. Both of those responses may not be normal. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's why I'm saying it may not be patentable. You may not be able to take this thing and say, this is what it is. So the only thing I'm thinking that we can think about, and I'm on a committee that's looking at what we should do as a university to have that we try to get all students to look at. And the idea that was going on in that committee was about reflective learning. I would say that we as an institution, we as a society, if we can figure out a way to get our students and our faculty to look at what it is we are about, our trajectory, and what we are passionate about, and can figure out a way that we can get people on that, we will have people doing what Julie Patton is doing. And some of them will get the imprimatur of fame that Theaster has gotten. But you cannot predict it, you cannot know it, because I sit in an art form that tells you I know musicians who are equally as talented, and some of them are wildly famous, and some of them are not. If you think we can do that, nobody has figured that out. But if we can get a way to get people to find that passion of why they do what they do and make it organic, then that's what I saw up on that stage. And I don't know how to tell you, but anyway, that's my 4 minutes of talk.
I want to take up from something you said, but also some of the discussions that happened yesterday, and they relate to this, particularly the idea of keeping a practice like this going. Because Theaster opened his talk yesterday by showing us his division of time, you know, God, 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 body, God, you know, and that kind of thing. And I was thinking of, I think Kevin brought up the idea of sort of capital, and Lydia, you laid out very beautifully yesterday Bourdieu's various, you know, social capital, cultural capital. And I was starting to think about, what does it mean to be eternally productive? And what's the space? I mean, can one really do continually? And it actually, after a long time, Richard, your discussion of music and theaster, which I don't think I'd been able to wrap my mind around quite until I thought about breath, which after all is the musician, the singer's endurance, the space of absolute endurance, which is you keep going because you know how to breathe. And so this is a kind of open-ended question about a practice that is very much about, that appears to be very much about sustaining an enormous level of energy. Theaster himself said at the end of yesterday's conference session that people sometimes meet him at the Museum of Modern Art or, you know, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago and say, why aren't you tired? And, you know, and he talked very much about finding an energy, and I understand the idea about calling and passion and so on, but I also think that it can easily translate into a relentless demand for productivity without understanding what is the shadow, the peripheral, the under, the odd, the other side of it that actually keeps that part of it buoyant. Back there, I think.
Oh, can we get the mic to go back? And maybe some of you who are behind, if you want to relocate to closer seats, you're welcome.
Excuse me. So I think that's actually a really interesting point that you're making, like the subtext, the behind the scenes workings of what's happening. And I couldn't help but last night after hearing Theaster speak, feel almost a little uncomfortable. I feel like in many ways, the success that he's experiencing is due to his embracing the structural inequities that exist in society, particularly in the art world. The example that you were giving about his work where he was shining people's shoes, for me, almost feels like a critique of what people's expectations are of him as a person based on his embodiment. Yeah. And he's brilliant. He's brilliant. I wanted to bring that to the table because I felt like people were laughing at his jokes, and some of his jokes made me cringe. And that reaction that I had was probably the most transformative experience for me as a person of color, hearing him speak. And quite frankly, I think because he was being honored, he was censoring himself. I felt like there's definitely a radical message to the work that he is doing. And he's doing it in a way that communicates value across communities, across difference, that he's exploiting the otherness that inherently exists in how we navigate the world, that he's using situated knowledge to bring people to the table that otherwise would have walked right past it because it says blacks only. I don't want to go too much on a rampage and derail this conversation, but I think it's really important to examine the value that is underlying the work that he does. And for me, I was truly, truly inspired when he was talking about it. It took him 20 years to get recognition, to be at the point that he's at. when I look at Fast Company and I see 24-year-olds younger than me even, and I'm probably young for this crowd, that are millionaires because they developed an app that does what? Hardly anything, has no social impact, is creating very little social change. And for me, that's really the power of the work that he does, is that while oftentimes simple and, I say in air quotes, participatory, he's exploiting systems that have been oppressing people for a long time. And well, racism, the structural construct of racism, and he's masterfully navigated that in a way that has created value for him and his work.
I want to pick up on what Rashid is saying, and maybe what I heard others saying, in that I think I at first thought exploiting when I was in Chicago. That verb came to me. He's exploiting systems of inequity. But the more I thought about it and the more I listened to him last night, I thought he's not really exploiting as much as he's reappropriating. And one of the things that came to me yesterday when we were having our panel is this notion that of compromise to sustain the breath, to sustain the productivity. So he was very clear about the fact that if you're going to be an artist, maybe you need to take some policy courses because you're going to need to know how to get the permit to do whatever, right? And I think one of the things I see here at the New School is students coming with a lot of social engagement, a lot of activism, a lot of interest, and I don't see any of those students in my science classes, not a single one. And to me, if you want to sort of reappropriate a system of money, of inequity, if you have a little science under your belt, you can reappropriate to the hilt, right? So for instance, when I was in graduate school, one of the largest fellowships we had was from the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. And it took a lot in me to decide whether I was going to use DOD money to further my education, because to me, that went against my morals, it went against my value system. But I thought, who better than me? Because if it's not me, it's going to be somebody who is aligned with that value system. So I could take that money, develop a very interesting biotechnological project that could serve the public good, but cloak it for the DOD to think, well, it could also be used for defense, right? So to me, there is this navigation that one has to do in order to either have the breadth or the money or the space or the resources to sustain work that does sometimes take 20 years to come to fruition, right? It doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes it's a very difficult, I think, ethical navigation that one has to do with their own value system, with the value systems of society, and knowing how to do that in a way that doesn't backfire and hurt the very people you're trying to support takes a lot of interdisciplinarity. And I just want to urge people to sort of remember what he said. He isn't a singular scholar, and as Lydia just described, this trajectory of accumulating different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of networks, and then reappropriating those structural systems of oppression for good, whatever that good might be, whether it's an aesthetic good, whether it's a social good, to me is sort of the central piece of his practice.
I want to keep going on that thread. And I like the word exploitation better, actually, because I think that it's more, I think it's clearer and more empowering, actually, right? Like, I mean, because wasn't that the thing that was getting you, that was inspiring you, right? And was the idea that, like, instead of feeling oppressed by racism, he was actually able to kind of use it, right? And make money off of it and make social good happen and take advantage of it, right? That is interesting to me. That's really transformative, right? And what I'm curious about is how let me make sure I'm asking exactly what I want. You know, the thing that I'm really curious about is that part of the work feels really hidden in a lot of ways, right? You know, especially if it's like, if it winds up in a gallery context where, you know, it's these objects that are kind of dislocated from the actual from the actual practice, one, and so how does that part become more visible, right? Because that feels like the radical, transformative, interesting part of these types of practice, right? The exploitation, right? I like that. I mean, that feels really important and an important part of this work. And the other thing that I'm wondering is the part where Rashid, where you were saying that you were cringing, right? Yeah, totally, me too. And I guess what I'm wondering is how do we? I feel like I approach Theaster Gates' work with such a concrete sense of right and what I've learned is right and wrong, and I feel like a lot of activists do this, right? And you wind up as an activist kind of thinking about your practice in terms of saying no to things, right? And so how do we all start to kind of use this type of work to start reimagining what we do in terms of saying yes? Because that's what he's doing. Yes, and exactly, yeah.